The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, like a shroud, the kind of October fog that made everything seem muffled and distant. Sarah Beth Martinez had always loved these autumn mornings, the way the maple trees along Elm Street blazed orange and red against the grey sky. At 17, she possessed that particular kind of small-town beauty, dark hair that caught the light, eyes that held secrets, and a smile that could make the local boys forget their own names. But on October 15, 1993, as she walked down the familiar sidewalk toward Millbrook High, Sarah Beth had no idea it would be the last time anyone would see her alive. Her worn leather backpack bounced against her shoulder as she hurried past the white picket fences and colonial houses that defined her neighborhood. The streets were unusually quiet for a Friday morning, most residents still wrapped in sleep or hidden behind steamed kitchen windows. Sarah Beth clutched her diary closer to her chest, a burgundy leather journal her grandmother had given her for her 16th birthday. She'd been writing in it religiously for over a year, documenting everything from her complicated feelings about Jake Morrison to her dreams of studying journalism at Penn State. If you're following this story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world as we explore these mysterious cases together. The Martinez family lived in a modest two-story house on Maple Avenue, just 6 blocks from the high school. Elena Martinez, Sarah Beth's mother, worked as a nurse at Millbrook General Hospital, putting in 12-hour shifts that often left her exhausted but never too tired to help her daughter with homework or listen to teenage problems. Roberto Martinez managed the local hardware store his family had owned for 3 generations, a business that had weathered the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and the economic uncertainties of the 1990s. They were pillars of the community, active in St. Catherine's Catholic Church and known for their generosity during the annual Christmas toy drives. That morning, Elena had been rushing to get ready for an early shift when Sarah Beth appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed for school in her favorite jeans and the blue sweater her aunt had sent from California. "Morning, Mummy," she'd said, grabbing an apple from the fruit bowl and giving her mother a quick kiss on the cheek. Elena remembered thinking how grown-up her daughter looked, how she was becoming more beautiful each day. "See you at dinner," Sarah Beth had called out as she headed for the front door, her voice carrying the casual confidence of someone who had never imagined that danger could touch her in this quiet Pennsylvania town. Roberto was already at the store by then, opening up for the contractors and farmers who always arrived early for supplies. He'd developed a routine over the years: unlock the doors at 6:30, start the coffee pot, and review the delivery schedules while the town slowly came to life around him. Millbrook Hardware was more than just a business. It was a gathering place where men discussed local politics, shared gossip, and debated the prospects of the high school football team. Roberto took pride in knowing every customer by name and remembering their children's birthdays and graduation dates. The first sign something was wrong came at 8:47 a.m. when Sarah Beth failed to arrive for her first period English class. Mrs. Henderson, a meticulous woman who'd been teaching for 32 years, immediately noticed the empty seat in the 3rd row. Sarah Beth Martinez was many things: spirited, occasionally defiant, prone to passionate debates about literature, but she was never absent without explanation. When the second period began and she still hadn't appeared, Mrs. Henderson sent a note to the principal's office, a knot of worry forming in her stomach. Principal Robert Kowalski had been leading Millbrook High for 15 years, long enough to develop an instinct about when something was genuinely wrong versus typical teenage drama. Sarah Beth wasn't the type to skip school for trivial reasons. She was college-bound, responsible, and deeply involved in extracurricular activities. When his secretary confirmed that the Martinez family hadn't called to report an illness or appointment, Kowalski picked up the phone to call Elena at the hospital. The conversation that followed would haunt Elena Martinez for the rest of her life. She'd been checking on a patient when the call came through, and the nurse who took the message had to repeat it twice before Elena fully understood. Sarah Beth hadn't arrived at school. No one had seen her since she'd left the house that morning. Elena's hands began to shake as she gathered her purse and car keys, her mind racing through possibilities while her heart refused to accept that any of them could be true. By lunch, word had spread through the hallways of Millbrook High like wildfire. Sarah Beth's best friend, Jessica Turner, stood by her locker fighting back tears as she explained to anyone who would listen that Sarah Beth had seemed perfectly normal the night before. They'd talked on the phone until nearly midnight, discussing their plans for homecoming the following week, gossiping about classmates, and complaining about their upcoming chemistry test. Jessica had been the last person to speak with Sarah Beth, and the weight of that knowledge would haunt her for decades to come. She was excited about something, Jessica told Detective Ray Coleman that afternoon, her voice barely above a whisper as they sat in the principal's office. She kept saying she had to tell me something important, but then she said it had to wait until she was sure. She said she needed to check something first. Jessica twisted her hands in her lap, trying to remember every detail of their conversation. I asked her what it was about, but she just laughed and said I'd find out soon enough. I thought maybe she was planning some kind of surprise for my birthday next month. Detective Coleman, a weathered man in his late 40s who'd spent 20 years working cases in rural Pennsylvania, took careful notes in his worn notebook. Millbrook wasn't the kind of place where teenagers simply vanished. In a town of barely 8,000 people, everyone knew everyone, and secrets were hard to keep. The fact that a well-liked girl from a respected family could disappear without a trace sent shockwaves through the community that would reverberate for decades to come. The detective's first step was to retrace Sarah Beth's route to school, walking the 6 blocks from Maple Avenue to the high school while questioning every neighbor and business owner along the way. Mrs. Kowalski, an elderly widow who spent most mornings tending to her flower garden, remembered seeing Sarah Beth walking past around 7:35. She looked just like always, the old woman told Detective Coleman, her voice trembling with concern. Maybe walking a little faster than usual, but nothing that seemed wrong. She even waved when she saw me. That wave would be the last confirmed sighting of Sarah Beth Martinez, somewhere between Mrs. Kowalski's house on Oak Street and the school building 4 blocks away. A 17-year-old girl with dreams of becoming a journalist had simply vanished into thin air. The investigation that followed would consume the resources of multiple law enforcement agencies and tear at the heart of a community that had always believed such things happened to other people in other places. As Friday afternoon turned to evening, the reality of Sarah Beth's disappearance began to sink in throughout Millbrook. Parents who had allowed their children to walk to school alone for years suddenly found themselves driving to pick up sons and daughters. Neighbors who had never bothered to lock their doors began checking and double-checking their deadbolts. The sense of safety and innocence that had defined this small Pennsylvania town was slipping away with each passing hour that brought no word of Sarah Beth's whereabouts. The search began immediately, but with a desperation that grew more pronounced as daylight faded. Within hours, volunteers from across Millbrook and neighboring townships had organized into search parties, their voices calling Sarah Beth's name through the dense woods that surrounded the town. They checked every abandoned building, every creek bed, every hunting cabin within a 10-mile radius. The local police department, aided by the Pennsylvania State Police, established a command center in the high school gymnasium, transforming the space where Sarah Beth had cheered at basketball games into a hub of frantic activity. Roberto Martinez closed the hardware store early that day, something he hadn't done in over a decade. He joined the search parties, his face grim with determination as he tramped through underbrush and called his daughter's name until his voice was hoarse. Eleanor, still wearing her hospital scrubs, coordinated with other volunteers, her nursing background making her invaluable in organizing the search effort. Neither parent spoke about their worst fears, but the terror was visible in their eyes as Friday night descended on Millbrook without any sign of their missing daughter. Father Michael O'Brien, the elderly priest at St. Catherine's, where the Martinez family had worshipped for over a decade, opened the church doors for an impromptu prayer vigil. The small stone church, built in 1887, had weathered many storms throughout its history, but it had never seen a crisis quite like this. Parishioners filled the wooden pews, their voices joining together in desperate prayers for Sarah Beth's safe return. Candles flickered in the dim light, casting dancing shadows on the stained glass windows that depicted scenes of hope and redemption. The basement of St. Catherine's, typically used for fellowship meals and youth group meetings, was quickly transformed into a coordination center where volunteers could grab coffee and sandwiches between search efforts. Women from the church auxiliary worked through the night, preparing food and offering comfort to the distraught family and exhausted searchers. The sense of community that had always defined Millbrook was never more evident than during those first terrible hours when everyone came together to find one of their own. Detective Coleman worked through the night, following up on the few leads that had emerged during the initial investigation. A gas station attendant thought he might have seen a girl matching Sarah Beth's description getting into a car with Pennsylvania plates, but he couldn't provide any details about the vehicle or its occupants. A truck driver reported seeing someone who looked like Sarah Beth walking along Route 15. But the timing didn't match with when she would have been walking to school. Every tip, no matter how vague or unlikely, was pursued with the desperate hope that it might lead to answers. As Saturday morning dawned grey and cold, the search expanded to include neighboring counties. State police brought in helicopters and search dogs, while FBI agents arrived to assess whether the case might involve kidnapping across state lines. The Martinez house became a command post, with law enforcement officials constantly coming and going, while Elena and Roberto waited by the phone for news that never came. Reporters from regional newspapers and television stations began arriving, turning the quiet residential street into a media circus that would persist for weeks. The case file grew thick with interviews, witness statements, and false leads that led nowhere. Sarah Beth's bedroom was carefully examined for any clues about her state of mind or possible destination. Her diary was notably absent from her usual hiding place in the desk drawer, leading investigators to believe she had taken it with her that morning. Her closest friends were questioned extensively about any boyfriends, any problems at home, any indication that she might have been planning to run away. Every answer painted the same picture: a happy, well-adjusted teenager with no reason to disappear voluntarily. Days turned into weeks, and weeks stretched toward months as the initial frenzy of the investigation gradually gave way to the grinding reality of a case that seemed to have no answers. Media attention began to fade, but the Martinez family never stopped believing their daughter would come home. Elena quit her job at the hospital to dedicate herself full-time to the search, while Roberto spent every free moment distributing flyers and following up on tips that came from across the country. The strain began to show in deep lines around their eyes and in the way they moved through their daily routines like sleepwalkers trapped in an endless nightmare. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Millbrook in snow that seemed to muffle not just sound, but hope itself. The search parties became smaller and less frequent, as the harsh Pennsylvania winter made outdoor investigations nearly impossible. But even as the snow piled high against the windows of their Maple Avenue home, Elena and Roberto Martinez continued to believe that somewhere, somehow, their daughter was still alive and waiting to be found. The Christmas tree that Elena put up that year remained unlit, its dark branches a silent testament to the emptiness that had invaded their home. The investigation continued into 1994, but with diminished resources and growing pressure to focus on other cases. Detective Coleman refused to let the file gather dust, reviewing it regularly and pursuing new leads as they emerged. But he also knew that without fresh evidence or witnesses, there was little more he could do. The Martinez family hired a private investigator, a former FBI agent named Patricia Wells, who specialized in missing persons cases and brought 20 years of experience to the search for Sarah Beth. Wells approached the case with fresh eyes and a systematic methodology that had solved dozens of missing persons cases throughout her career. She interviewed everyone who had been questioned before, looking for inconsistencies or details that might have been overlooked. She examined the physical evidence again, studied maps of the area, and developed new theories about what might have happened to Sarah Beth. Despite her expertise and dedication, even Wells found herself frustrated by the complete lack of physical evidence or reliable witnesses. Years passed with agonizing slowness, each birthday and Christmas marking another milestone in Sarah Beth's absence. High school classmates graduated and moved away to college or jobs in bigger cities, carrying with them memories of the girl who had vanished during their senior year. Jessica Turner struggled through her remaining months at Millbrook High, the weight of being Sarah Beth's last conversation making it difficult to enjoy normal teenage experiences. She eventually became a social worker, driven by a desire to help other families in crisis and haunted by the feeling that she might have prevented her best friend's disappearance if she had just asked the right questions. Elena Martinez aged decades in the span of a few years, her dark hair turning prematurely grey as the stress of not knowing took its toll on her body and spirit. She developed a habit of staring out the kitchen window toward the high school, as if she might spot her daughter walking home for dinner after all these years. Roberto threw himself into expanding the hardware store, working 16-hour days to avoid coming home to the silence that filled Sarah Beth's empty bedroom. They moved through their lives like actors playing roles they'd never auditioned for, the parents of a missing child, suspended in a limbo between hope and grief that seemed to have no end. The 10th anniversary of Sarah Beth's disappearance brought renewed media attention and a fresh wave of tips from people who thought they might have seen her in other states. A reporter from the Philadelphia Inquirer wrote a lengthy feature article about cold cases in rural Pennsylvania, with Sarah Beth's story prominently featured alongside photographs from her junior year and images of the massive search efforts that had consumed Millbrook in 1993. The article generated dozens of new leads, but like all the others before them, they ultimately led nowhere, leaving the family with renewed hope, followed by familiar disappointment. Detective Coleman had retired by then, replaced by younger officers who knew Sarah Beth's case only as a thick file folder filled with decades of false leads and dead ends. The new investigators approached the case with professionalism and dedication, but they lacked the personal connection that had driven Coleman's relentless pursuit of answers. The original missing person posters had faded and been replaced multiple times over the years, but Sarah Beth's face remained a constant presence throughout Millbrook, on the bulletin board at the post office, in the window of Martinez Hardware, and in the hearts of everyone who remembered that terrible October morning when innocence had been lost forever. The 20th anniversary passed more quietly, marked only by a small ceremony at St. Catherine's and a brief mention in the local newspaper. By then, many of the original searchers had died or moved away, and a new generation of Millbrook residents knew Sarah Beth's story only as local legend. But for those who had lived through the disappearance, the mystery remained as compelling and heartbreaking as ever, a reminder that some questions might never be answered, and some wounds might never fully heal. Elena Martinez succumbed to cancer in 2018, 25 years after her daughter's disappearance, never knowing what had happened to Sarah Beth or whether she might still be alive somewhere. Her final words, according to the nurses at Millbrook General, where she had once worked, were a plea for someone to keep looking for her daughter. Roberto, now suffering from advancing dementia, was moved to a care facility where he spent his days asking nurses when Sarah Beth would be coming to visit, his mind having retreated to a time when his daughter was still safe at home. The house on Maple Avenue sat empty after Roberto's departure, too full of memories for his siblings to sell, but too painful for anyone to inhabit. Sarah Beth's bedroom remained exactly as she had left it on that October morning in 1993, her bed made, her clothes hanging in the closet, her books stacked neatly on the desk where her diary should have been. Neighbors reported seeing lights in the windows sometimes, but it was only the automatic timers that Roberto had installed years earlier, still faithfully turning lamps on and off in a house where no one lived anymore. Father O'Brien had passed away peacefully in his sleep in 2011 at the age of 84, having served the St. Catherine's parish for over 4 decades. He had been universally beloved in the community, remembered as a gentleman who had provided comfort to countless families during their darkest hours. His funeral had filled the church to capacity, with mourners traveling from across Pennsylvania to pay their respects to a priest who had touched so many lives with his kindness and wisdom. The current pastor, Father David Chen, had arrived in Millbrook just 3 years earlier, drawn to the small-town parish after spending a decade working in urban Philadelphia. He was a practical man who believed in the power of faith, but also understood the importance of maintaining aging buildings and managing tight budgets. St. Catherine's had been built on a hillside, and more than a century of Pennsylvania winters had taken their toll on the stone structure, creating problems that could no longer be ignored. It was Father Chen who first noticed the serious issues with the church's foundation. Water damage in the basement had become increasingly problematic, with flooding occurring during every heavy rainstorm. The stone walls showed signs of deterioration, and structural engineers warned that without major repairs, the building's stability could be compromised. The parish council, after months of debate and fundraising, finally approved the funds for a comprehensive renovation project that would address both the immediate problems and ensure the church's survival for future generations. The renovation work began in earnest during the summer of 2023, exactly 30 years after Sarah Beth Martinez had vanished without a trace. The construction crew, led by a local contractor named Mike Petrosky, who had grown up in Millbrook, approached the project with the careful attention that century-old buildings required. They began by excavating around the foundation to install new drainage systems and waterproofing, work that required digging several feet below the existing basement floor. Petrosky had been just a few years behind Sarah Beth in school, and he remembered the shock and fear that had gripped the community when she disappeared. The case had been a defining moment in his childhood, marking the end of the carefree innocence that had characterized growing up in small-town Pennsylvania. As he supervised the excavation work, he couldn't help but think about all the secrets that old buildings might hold, the stories buried beneath layers of concrete and stone. The basement of St. Catherine's was larger than most people realized, extending under not just the main sanctuary, but also beneath the small rectory that housed the parish offices. The construction revealed evidence of multiple renovations over the decades, with newer concrete poured over older foundations in a patchwork pattern that spoke to generations of maintenance and repair. Some sections of the basement had been sealed off entirely, their original purposes lost to time and changing needs. On a sweltering afternoon in late July, two of Petrosky's workers were digging near the southeast corner of the foundation when their shovels struck something that wasn't stone or soil. At first, they assumed it was an old water pipe or electrical conduit, common discoveries in buildings of this age. But as they carefully cleared away the dirt and debris, they realized they had found something far more significant, something that would finally provide answers to questions that had haunted Millbrook for 3 decades. Wrapped in what appeared to be a deteriorated plastic bag, partially buried beneath a layer of concrete that had been poured sometime in the mid-1990s, was a leather-bound book. Its burgundy cover was stained and warped from years of moisture, but it was still recognizable as a diary or journal. The initials SBM were still visible on the cover, pressed into the leather in faded gold lettering that caught the dim basement light like a whisper from the past. Mike Petrosky felt his hands trembling as he held the water-damaged diary, understanding immediately what he had discovered. This was Sarah Beth Martinez's missing journal, the one that investigators had assumed she had taken with her on that October morning in 1993. But if the diary was here, buried beneath the church where her family had prayed for her safe return for so many years, what did that mean for the mystery of her disappearance? The implications were too horrifying to contemplate, yet impossible to ignore. Within an hour, the construction site had been transformed into a crime scene. The Millbrook Police Department, now led by Chief Linda Santos, cordoned off the area while forensic experts carefully excavated the diary and the surrounding soil. Santos had grown up in a neighboring town, but she knew Sarah Beth's story well. It had become part of the regional folklore, a cautionary tale that parents used to warn their children about the dangers that could lurk even in the safest seeming places. The diary was carefully transported to the State Police Forensic Laboratory, where experts worked to preserve and photograph each page before the damage could worsen. What they found in those water-stained pages would shock a community that thought it had already endured every possible tragedy. Sarah Beth's own words, written in her familiar handwriting during the weeks leading up to her disappearance, revealed a secret so devastating that it had ultimately cost her her life. The entries from September and early October 1993 painted a picture of a teenager grappling with knowledge that she was too young and too trusting to handle safely. Sarah Beth had apparently witnessed something during a late-evening youth group meeting at St. Catherine's, something involving Father O'Brien that had filled her with confusion and terror. The exact nature of what she had seen was never explicitly stated in the diary. She had been too afraid to put the full truth into words, even in her private journal. But her fear was palpable in every carefully chosen phrase, in the way she struggled to understand how someone she had trusted and admired could be capable of such betrayal. She wrote about feeling sick to her stomach, about lying awake at night staring at the ceiling, about wanting desperately to tell her parents but being afraid they wouldn't believe her accusations against such a respected member of the community. The entries revealed a young woman trapped between her desire to do the right thing and her terror of the consequences. In her final entry, dated October 14, 1993, the night before she disappeared, Sarah Beth had written about her decision to confront Father O'Brien directly. She had planned to speak with him after morning mass, to give him a chance to explain what she had witnessed, and perhaps to find some innocent explanation that would allow her to continue believing in the goodness of someone she had looked up to for so many years. The entry ended with a prayer for courage and a promise to herself that she would seek the truth, no matter how difficult or frightening it might be. The discovery of the diary sent shockwaves through Millbrook that rivaled those felt 30 years earlier, but this time the horror was compounded by the realization that the person responsible for Sarah Beth's disappearance had been hiding in plain sight for decades. Father O'Brien, the gentle priest who had comforted the Martinez family and led prayer vigils for their missing daughter, had apparently been the one who had silenced her forever. But Father O'Brien had been dead for over a decade, having passed away peacefully in 2011 with his reputation intact and his secrets seemingly buried with him. The FBI was called in to take over the investigation, and within days, federal agents were conducting extensive forensic examinations of the church basement, looking for any additional evidence that might help them understand what had happened to Sarah Beth Martinez during her final hours. What they found beneath the layers of concrete that had been poured in 1995, just 12 feet from where the diary had been discovered, would finally provide the closure that the Martinez family and the town of Millbrook had been seeking for 30 long years. The remains of Sarah Beth Martinez lay in a makeshift grave, wrapped in what appeared to be church linens and buried with a haste that spoke to panic rather than planning. Forensic examination revealed that she had died from blunt force trauma to the head, a single devastating blow that had killed her almost instantly. There was no evidence of sexual assault, suggesting that her murder had been motivated by desperation rather than any other criminal intent. The medical examiner estimated that she had been killed shortly after her disappearance, likely within hours of when she was last seen walking to school on that October morning in 1993. Further investigation into Father O'Brien's background revealed a history that the diocese had worked hard to conceal. Financial records showed significant irregularities in the church's accounts during the early 1990s, with thousands of dollars mysteriously disappearing from various funds. Bank records revealed that O'Brien had been struggling with gambling debts, having developed an addiction to poker games in Atlantic City that had spiraled out of control during the recession of the early 1990s. The investigation also uncovered evidence of a cover-up that had involved multiple people within the church hierarchy. Father Thomas Quinn, a visiting priest from the diocese who had been at St. Catherine's during the time of Sarah Beth's disappearance, had apparently known about O'Brien's financial crimes and had been blackmailing him for a share of the stolen funds. Quinn had died in a suspicious car accident in 1995, just 2 years after Sarah Beth's murder, in what investigators now believed had been another desperate attempt by O'Brien to silence someone who threatened to expose his secrets. The revelation that Sarah Beth Martinez had been murdered by the very priest who had led prayer vigils for her safe return was almost too painful for the community to bear. Many longtime parishioners struggled to reconcile their memories of Father O'Brien's kindness with the reality of his crimes. Some refused to believe the evidence, preferring to cling to their image of the gentle pastor who had baptized their children and comforted them in times of loss. The Catholic diocese issued formal apologies and established a victims' fund for the Martinez family, though no amount of money could compensate for 30 years of unanswered questions and unresolved grief. Bishop William Morrison, who had known Father O'Brien personally, struggled to understand how he had failed to recognize the warning signs of a man capable of such betrayal. The scandal rocked the regional Catholic community and led to new protocols for financial oversight and background investigations of clergy members. Roberto Martinez, despite his advancing dementia, seemed to understand when his nephew explained that Sarah Beth had finally been found. In his more lucid moments, he expressed relief that his daughter could finally receive a proper burial and that the family's long nightmare was over. "She was such a good girl," he kept repeating, his weathered hands shaking as he looked at photographs of the daughter he had lost so many years ago. She just wanted to do the right thing. The funeral service for Sarah Beth Martinez was held at St. Catherine's Church in August 2023, exactly 30 years after her disappearance. The sanctuary was packed with mourners who had never stopped hoping for her return. their tears mixing grief for a life cut short with relief that the mystery had finally been solved. Father Chen presided over the service, his voice breaking as he spoke about the courage of a young woman who had paid the ultimate price for her commitment to truth and justice. Jessica Turner, now a middle-aged woman with children of her own, served as one of the pallbearers, her face etched with the pain of 3 decades spent wondering if there was something more she could have done. At the funeral, she placed a single red rose on Sarah Beth's casket and whispered an apology for not being there when her best friend had needed her most. "I should have known," she told reporters afterward. "She was trying to tell me something that last night we talked, but I was too young and too naive to understand." Sarah Beth was laid to rest next to her mother in Millbrook Cemetery, her headstone reading simply, "Beloved daughter, finally home." The cemetery service was attended by hundreds of people from across Pennsylvania, many of whom had followed the case for decades without ever losing hope that the truth would eventually emerge. As dirt was shoveled onto the casket, there was a sense of justice finally being served, even though it had come far too late for a family that had been destroyed by 30 years of uncertainty. The renovation of St. Catherine's Church was completed in September 2023, but the building would forever be marked by the tragedy that had been hidden beneath its foundation for so many years. Father Chen worked with the parish council to create a memorial garden dedicated to Sarah Beth Martinez, installed near the spot where her diary had been discovered. The garden featured a bronze plaque with her photograph and a quote from her diary about seeking truth and justice, serving as a reminder of the courage it takes to stand up against evil. The church community, struggling to rebuild trust after the revelations about Father O'Brien, committed itself to creating a safe space where victims of abuse and violence could seek help without fear of judgment or retribution. Father Chen established a crisis counseling program and worked closely with local law enforcement to ensure that such a tragedy could never happen again. "We failed Sarah Beth 30 years ago," he told his congregation during a special memorial service. "We cannot fail others who might need our help in the future." The case of Sarah Beth Martinez became a catalyst for broader changes in how missing persons investigations were conducted throughout rural Pennsylvania. New protocols were established for interagency cooperation, ensuring that small police departments would have access to the resources and expertise needed to handle complex cases. The Pennsylvania Attorney General's office created a cold case unit specifically dedicated to reviewing unsolved disappearances, with Sarah Beth's case serving as a model for how persistence and modern forensic techniques could finally bring justice to victims and their families. Mike Petrosky, the contractor whose crew had discovered the diary, found himself profoundly changed by the experience of uncovering such a significant piece of evidence. He had known Sarah Beth only in passing during their school years, but the responsibility of bringing her story to light had given him a new perspective on the importance of community and the fragility of innocent life. He donated his services to create the Memorial Garden at St. Catherine's and established a scholarship fund for Millbrook High School students planning to study journalism, honoring Sarah Beth's dream of becoming a reporter who could seek truth and expose injustice. The house on Maple Avenue, empty since Roberto Martinez had been moved to the care facility, was eventually donated to a non-profit organization that provided transitional housing for families of missing persons. It seemed fitting that a home which had been frozen in time by tragedy would become a place of hope and healing for others facing similar ordeals. Elena Martinez's kitchen, where she had spent so many years watching for her daughter's return, was converted into a comfortable common area where families could find support and understanding from others who had walked the same difficult path. As the first anniversary of the diary's discovery approached in July 2024, Millbrook had begun to heal from the trauma that had defined the community for 3 decades. The truth about Sarah Beth's death had been painful to accept, but it had also freed the town from the uncertainty and fear that had haunted its residents for so long. Children could once again walk to school without their parents constantly worrying about mysterious disappearances, and the community could finally move forward while still honoring the memory of a brave young woman whose courage had ultimately led to justice. The story of Sarah Beth Martinez serves as a powerful reminder that the truth, no matter how long it remains hidden or how carefully it is concealed, has a way of eventually coming to light. Her diary, preserved for 30 years beneath the stone foundation of the very church where she had worshipped and trusted, had finally given voice to a young woman whose life had been cut tragically short by the evil of someone she had believed in and respected. In death, Sarah Beth had achieved her dream of being a journalist, as her own words had finally told the most important story of all. The story of what really happened on that misty October morning in 1993, when a courageous teenager decided to confront a trusted authority figure about his crimes and paid the ultimate price for her integrity. Her legacy continued to inspire others to speak out against injustice and to never stop seeking the truth, no matter how powerful or respected the perpetrators might be. The case was officially closed in August 2024, bringing an end to one of Pennsylvania's longest-running missing persons investigations.